All right, now let's talk about the QR file structure. How did I build my widget? First thing, I looked in the internet for a library that does QR codes. I find a few, and after some research, I enjoyed very much this one, developed by Dave Shim. Very nice, simple, straight usage, and with an MIT license. So I grabbed his files, I download his files, and I add those files to a folder. I put pretty much everything in this QR folder. There we go. You see his license, the QR code JS without being minified, the minified version. So I could check here if there was any malicious code or anything. It's very important for you to be aware that what the third-party library is trying to do. Then I learned how to use his library, looking up the readme.md, and I was ready to use it. So when I was ready to use it, I came to my widget.js. I pretty much in my init function, I defined some basic values and default values for my widget. I empty my node because, as you know, when I create my widget, it inserts a div element to my widget. In this case, I don't want. I want the node completely empty. So I can give, because this library that I'm using asks for a node, for HTML node that in the library is going to create everything by itself. So I just empty the node. I call my third-party library, and I associate that to an internal variable. After that, I did a repaint function. Let's just clear and repaint my widget. I get a get content and a set content type of methods. Perfect. Now, the most important part, especially for me, you notice that when you go to your widget, and if you click here, you have two values. And those two values, you can put any value here, and it's going to automatically set the content of your widget. Or you can pass your data source. In this case, accepts any strings, any attributes that are strings, and builds up your to build up your QR code. How did I add those two values here to my panel that will be subsequently added to my HTML? So the way to do that is to add a property. So I just come to my widget.js, I add a property that's called content. I could call anything I want. That's open for you to decide. And when that value changes, I set the content. That's all I need to do to bind my widget to the data source. Pretty handy, pretty powerful, right? So from that on, my widget here, if I bind to a data source, it reacts and it does all the job to as a regular Wakanda widget. All right, now let's talk about designer. The designer.js is very simple. I just receive the widget and I set the height and the width just to have a little square in the studio. And one of the most important things is the package.json, because the package.json comes ready for you to use if you are coding from scratch and you don't use any third-party library. But since I need to load my QR code, and I prefer to load the min.js as a minified version, I need to add that to my package. So I go to my package and I add it in the right order, my minified version. So I'm going to load the widget.js and the QR code.js, and of course my CSS and my designer. Just to notice that my CSS, in this case, I ask it to be just a studio only. That's my option. I just want that if at runtime there is no QR code to draw, I don't want any background or anything in the image. or any image. I just want pure blank. And also the designer.js has always a studio only. This is by default. This one I inserted on purpose. So I decide that my CSS is only for studio. So when I drag my widget here, I see this nice gradient that happens, but I don't see the same thing at runtime. And if I look my CSS, I will see that CSS has this gradient defined here. Right, I use the same thing as any widget. I have the selector WAF widget, and then WAF dash the name of the widget in lowercase, and here define my CSS. But in this case, just repeating in the package JSON, I decide that the CSS is just for Studio. All right, and that's pretty much all. I hope you enjoy the widget.